Hello, everyone. Hope you're holding on. Welcome to my review of Chapter 990 of One Piece. We are officially 10 chapters away from One Piece Chapter 1000. In this chapter, Oda takes the opportunity to introduce a factor that has the effect of automatically upping the stakes for this fight in Wano, and that is the fact that there is now a 99% chance of a character meeting their end during this conflict.
I was glad to see Lola and Jafon finally rethink their reaction and help their father come aboard. Apparently, Big Mom wouldn't stop complaining about Pound, and that's how they figured it out. But the most important part of this is that Baby Pez is happy. Now, there are two plot lines in this cover story that I'm not really sure what Oda is going to do with. The first one is the plot line with the Germ Pirates. I'm not sure what's going to happen to them, if they're going to show up again in this cover story or not. And then the other plot line is the Tontada. I'm not sure if Oda is going to have them do something else here, or if they're just going to stay behind in Dressrosa and pop up later in the story. But regardless, I do think that we're going to get a cover that shows the entire Capone Beige family together, united, kind of like to have Pound's first official family portrait, and then maybe he can replace the picture in his locket with a new picture of him with his daughters. We come to find out that Big Mom's spear of Elbaf destroyed the sacred tree that Sasaki was tied to, therefore freeing Sasaki. And so I actually went back to chapter 982, which is the chapter where Sasaki gets chained up, and it does seem like the tree that he's tied up to has a rope and some ornaments around it, which is representative of what the Japanese call a Yorishido tree. And a Yorishido tree is a type of sacred tree that is very old, that is either divine by itself or has the ability to attract kami spirits to it. So I find it very interesting that in the beginning of this chapter, we find out that a sacred tree or a divine tree has been destroyed. And then later on, Hyogoro makes the connection that Luffy looks like a Myoho, or a knowledge king, or a wisdom king, which are essentially, those are Buddhist deities that are supposed to be the guardians of Buddhism. Now, what's interesting about Hyogoro making that observation is that his own design, when he was in his prime, is also a reference to one of the Wisdom Kings.
Hyogoro's comment also got me thinking about Enel in his 200 million bolt form, but technically speaking, Enel in that form is a reference to Raijin, the god of thunder, not one of the Wisdom Kings, but, just got me thinking about that. Anyway, going back to the point that I was making about Sasaki's tree, I find it very interesting how in the beginning of this chapter, Oda essentially lets us know that this sacred divine tree has been destroyed in Onigashima, and then in the very same chapter, he has Hyogoro frame Luffy as this divine entity, right? As this guardian spiritual entity. So I feel like there are two ways of looking at that. The first one is that maybe the tree fulfilled its purpose, because remember, in the Shinto religion, one of the purposes of those sacred trees is to attract other divine spirits to them. So by Luffy being like the divine entity in this chapter, maybe the tree fulfilled its purpose by drawing Luffy to the island, and that's why, it's no longer needed, because Luffy is now the guardian of the island, per se. Or if we're strictly sticking to the Mio/Wisdom King reference, it turns out that there's actually a total of 5 Wisdom King, okay? And so that could be a nudge, that could be a bit of foreshadowing to Gear 5 or Gear 5th in terms of what Oda is going to draw inspiration from and incorporate in the appearance of Gear 5th with the mythology of the Wisdom Kings, the 5 Wisdom Kings. Anyway, it seems that the beginning scene with Sasaki is setting up a fight between him and Denjiro in the future, because Sasaki says that the price for betraying him is pretty big. It's not something that he just brushes off.
We go to the top of Onigashima, and it seems like Kaido hasn't done much of anything yet. He's just letting his men go first while he stares everybody down. I guess he's adopted the chess player mentality of letting the pawns go first. However, I'm not really sure why he doesn't just shoot a blast at the samurai, because right there, he's in a perfect position to do that. I mean, maybe an excuse would be that he just doesn't want to damage the skull, even though he already busted a hole through it getting up there. Or maybe he's just worried that his blast is going to hit his own men. Yeah, I'll go with that one. That makes more sense. So the Minks are fighting. We get a shot of Shishilian there, and then later we see Blackback the gorilla and Giovanni the zebra being whipped back by Jack. And Jack now has swords sticking out of him, And if you remember in one of the previous chapters, Jack actually tells his men, don't fall back, hold your ground, because the Mink's Zulong form is short-lived, right? It doesn't last very long. So what Jack is trying to do here is he's trying to wait out the Minks in his normal mammoth form, right, as long as possible. And then once the Zulong form runs out, then he can go into hybrid form, which is his strongest form, and begin the counterattack.
Now, of course, we see that Oda's silhouette fetish is back because we don't get to see Inuarashi's Sulong form yet, and we don't get to see Nekomamushi's Sulong form yet. All we get are these very intimidating looking silhouettes. They stop Kinemon from advancing, and then they jump over at Jack. So I feel like that could be enough. Those two together in Sulong form could be enough to push Jack to go into his hybrid form early and say, like, I can't keep stalling these guys. Like, this is way too much. I have to go into hybrid form if I'm going to keep up. And I do think it's pretty well established, thanks to this chapter, that Jack is Nekomamushi and Inuarashi's fight. Because in the official translation, they stop Kinemon and say, no, Kinemon, this one's ours. So they're calling dibs on Jack, So unless they get defeated and they can't do anything, then maybe somebody else has to fight Jack. But up until this point, like, they're calling dibs. We head back into the Skull Dome, and I was very confused because we see King sitting on a balcony on the Dendenmushi, and I was like, but didn't last week's chapter end with King coming down from the skies in his Pteranodon form, leading an army of winged creatures towards the Straw Hats? Like, it made me feel like I had skipped a panel or a page because I couldn't find that winged army that we saw in the last chapter. I mean, there are some small little dark figures there near the top of the roof in that panel where we shift over inside of the skull, but still, it just felt very inconsistent to not show those flying fighters, those winged creatures fully in this chapter. That kind of gets me to think that maybe they weren't just gifters then, that maybe they were something different, because if they were just normal, average-looking gifters, gifters aren't average, but you know what I mean, if they were just normal gifters, why not show them? The conversation there between King and Queen is really funny, though. It almost reads like a conversation between Sanji and Zoro, almost. And now Queen has figured out that they were probably threatening Babanuki, Old Maid, into saying that everything was fine back in Udon. Basically, if you remember what happened was that Tama, because Tama has the ability to create like the Kibidango and feed them to animals, and those animals have to follow her orders. So what she did was that she fed Babanuki some of those Kibidango from her Devil Fruit ability. And so given that Babanuki is half elephant, he had no choice but to comply with Tama's orders and tell Queen that everything was fine. King calls the Tobiropo for backup, and he informs them that the Yonko Commander Challenge is off. Now the goal is to stop the Straw Hat Alliance from going up to the roof. And because of that, because he tells the Tobiropo that their goal is to stop the Straw Hats from climbing up, I can kind of see like an Enies Lobby sort of scenario where each of the fights takes place in a different floor. So it's probably going to be like the further you go up, the tougher the opponent. By the way, quick shout out to Ulti and Pepe for getting upset at being called brats. That was really funny.
King's call transfers to a room where Drake and Hawkins are, and the first thing I noticed was that very cool looking giant Kabuto helmet in the back behind Hawkins. It's a very nice looking piece, and I doubt that Oda drew that helmet just for decoration, so I'm very curious who that helmet belongs to and whether or not it's going to be used by somebody in the story in the near future. Now, because Hawkins is the magician of the supernova, he kind of gets this Doctor Strange moment here where he's looking at the odds to make his calculations, and he says that there's a 1% chance of a certain character being alive by tomorrow. Now, my first initial thought was that he was talking about Drake's odds of survival.
But then I read the scene more carefully, and it turns out that there's something in that scene that makes me think that it's not Drake. But I'll talk about that a little bit later.
So to me, the character that has a 1% chance of being alive by tomorrow has to be one of the following. It has to be either Kaido, Luffy, or Law, okay? It would make sense that Hawkins is trying to calculate Kaido's odds because he hasn't really been sold on being part of his crew anyway. And we already know that Hawkins is going to end up joining the Alliance at some point.
And Drake kind of nudges him in this chapter when he says, Onigashima is in chaos now,
you, Hawkins, didn't join this group by choice. If you're going to betray them, now is the time.
And then Hawkins says, you want me to turn traitor? Don't make me laugh. So he's not there yet, but I can definitely see all of the supernovas joining Luffy's alliance at some point. Apu is the more complicated one. Like, that's the one that I'm just kind of like not sure how that's going to work, but I can see the supernovas working together to defeat Kaido. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now, if Kaido is the 1%, right, it makes sense why Hawkins isn't sharing that information. Because if we find out that it is Kaido who has the 1% chance of being alive, then that would ruin the tension. The second option is that it's Luffy, because he's the main character, and it would make sense for him to be near the brink of death during the final stages of his fight with Kaido. Now, in Marineford, there's actually a scene that is very reminiscent of this scene where after Law saves Luffy, Hawkins is trying to figure out the odds of Luffy surviving. And Hawkins says that the odds, according to the cards, the odds never reach 0, meaning that Luffy always has a chance of surviving. It's called being the main character.
And that's actually the main reason for why I don't want it to be Luffy. Because if Luffy is the one that Hawkins is referring to, if the 1% chance refers to Luffy, then that literally means nothing. Since Luffy is the main character of this story, his chances of survival, his real chances of survival until he gets to Laugh Tale and finds the One Piece are 100%. Okay? So that's why I don't want that prediction to be about Luffy. It would be much more interesting if it were about another character. Now here's the thing. In the beginning of Wano, all right, when Hawkins runs into Luffy and Zoro, Hawkins actually predicts that the odds of Luffy and Zoro being alive by the end of the month are 19%. And to my knowledge, a month hasn't gone by since the Straw Hats arrived in Wano. So technically speaking, I think you could say that Luffy and Zoro are not the 1%. Now that being said, right, it's important to remember that he was actually predicting the probability for both of them. So I don't know if like it could have been that like maybe Zoro had an 18% chance of surviving and then Luffy had the 1% or something like that. You know, maybe it was a different split. Maybe it was 14 and 5%. You get the picture. Now the reason for why I don't think that 1% is referring to Drake is because if you notice in that scene with Hawkins and Drake, when Who's Who comes in, he's like, Drake, follow me. We got to take advantage of this chaos. I'm going for Queen. And then Drake says, don't get me involved. Are you sure you're going to take out one of our guys right now? And he walks away, and then we cut away immediately to Hawkins, and Hawkins is still playing with his cards. So to me, that's the moment where Hawkins is trying to figure out Drake's odds. Not before, right? Because before he calculated a 1% for somebody else, that percentage is fixed. There's no need to calculate for Drake again. Also, if the 1% was referring to Drake, I think Oda would have ended the chapter with Hawkins revealing that the calculation, the card was for Drake, that 1%. There's no need to like not have it be revealed in this chapter if Drake was the 1%. So I definitely think that 1% chance of survival is referring to either Kaido or Law.
Now the reason for why I think it could be Law is because Hawkins already knows that it was Drake, the one who helped Law escape, right? So Hawkins could probably be wondering, why did Drake do that? In other words, what is so special about Law that Drake decided to go ahead and blow his own cover to help him escape? So let me plug in Law's numbers here real quick just to figure out his odds. Now, because of the way the scene is structured, right, it obviously sets up a scene later where Hawkins has to reveal to the reader who he was referring to with that 1% chance. And there also has to be the reveal of what that 1% chance is. So I definitely expect a moment like in Avengers Endgame during the final battle where Drake looks over at Hawkins and Hawkins says, "This is it, Drake. This is the 1% chance." But in order for that 1% chance to become a reality, other things need to fall in place. So I can definitely see something like Luffy being at the brink of death and then Law stepping in to perform the immortality surgery on Luffy by sacrificing himself. In other words, Law can end up being Luffy's 1% chance. Now I know some people don't like the idea of Luffy having the immortality surgery being performed on him because that would make him way too OP, too broken. But I think Teach can show up and then because he has the power to absorb devil fruit powers, devil fruit abilities, I think he could absorb Luffy's immortality if that were the case. So I think Oda could find a way of having Blackbeard be the one to take Luffy's immortality away. And even if it's not Law, the one who sacrifices himself, that 1% chance has to come at a price. Because if it doesn't have a price, then why is it so low, right? So I think another sacrifice will have to be made if it's not Law. Again, it's like Endgame, right? In order for people to win, in order for people to live, certain conditions need to be met. And sometimes those conditions require sacrifice.
By the way, before I forget, just something very quick about Law. In chapter 950, we see Drake and Hawkins go into Law's prison cell. Because remember, Law got captured by Hawkins, right? Because Hawkins kind of blackmailed him by having Beppo and Penguin and Shachi captured. And so Law is captured, and Drake and Hawkins go into his prison cell, and then Hawkins turns to Drake and says, you know, you've been acting kind of weird lately. And then Drake is like, oh, it's nothing. And then the next time we see Hawkins, right, we find that he has been defeated. So Hawkins has been defeated by Law, and then Law walks out of that cell, and he says to Drake, you know, if this is part of your plan, then I'll just go along with it. So my question is, how is Drake able to betray Hawkins in that scene? And then all of a sudden, when we first see Drake and Hawkins in this chapter, they're talking as if nothing had happened. And again, Hawkins and Drake were there together, right? Just there, like super close to each other, right? Like half a feet apart. And then all of a sudden, Hawkins is on the ground and Law is leaving the cell. So did Hawkins not notice that it was Drake who betrayed him in that scene? Again, chapter 950, you can check it for yourselves. Hawkins and Drake are together. Then a couple of chapters later, Hawkins is on the floor. Law walks out of the prison cell and he meets Drake on the outside of the prison cell. And then like Hawkins and Drake are talking in this chapter as if that never happened. In the beginning, right? In the beginning, because yes, Hawkins has to kind of pretend that he doesn't know that Queen and Husu are setting Drake up. But it just seems really strange that there was no confrontation previous to this moment between Hawkins and Drake. Hey, why did you betray me? I saw you. You were right there. Another thing is, didn't we see Hawkins hanging with Law recently? In the chapter where we find out that Perospero and Marco are going inside the skull, like there was a shot of Law with somebody that looked like Hawkins right next to him, right? And granted, we didn't get to see Hawkins from the front, but the back, like the way his hair is just, it looks a lot like Hawkins. And I know some people were saying that it was Heat who was with Law, but I actually looked at Heat, like, and his design, his hair is way more puffy than what we get in that scene. So I don't know if that's supposed to be Hawkins, but if it is, I think it's clear that Hawkins now has a deal of his own with Law. So he could have an ace up his sleeve that we don't know about. We get a shot of the Oniwabanchu fighting the samurai, and all of a sudden their leader, Fukurokuju, kind of steps away, just turns away from the fight and walks off. And the Mimawarigumi guy notices that, so I'm guessing that he's gonna follow him. It's kind of strange. Like, I don't know why he's doing that. My guess is that maybe he suspects or he knows that Orochi did not die, and so he's going over to his body or something. And it's already been foreshadowed that Fukurokuju is going to be the one to fight Raizo during this conflict, because they used to be rivals. So just like Fukurokuju kind of has an opponent, the beginning of the chapter kind of sets up Sasaki versus Denjiro. So Fukurokuju should be sticking around for his fight against Raizo.
I really liked the layout of that scene with Jinbei and Zoro versus Number 5's club. Like, if you look at the way that Oda structured the page, Zoro is slashing with his left arm, and then Jinbei is blocking with his right arm. And it doesn't look like either of them is using haki, because Zoro's sword doesn't seem coated, and Jinbei's arm doesn't look coated either. And then in between their panels, we get Luffy. So I think symbolically speaking, it kind of makes it seem as if Jinbei and Zoro are Luffy's right and left arms, at least visually, because of the way that Oda structured that page. I also really enjoyed the callback to Thriller Bark, where Luffy says that back then, somebody the size of Ors would have taken the entire crew to take down, similar to how it was with the Pacifista, where it would take the entire crew just to take one down, but now post-time skip, Luffy can essentially one-shot one and then Zoro and Sanji can cut and break its neck in one hit as well. Now, we already talked about this, but in chapter 975, we see that Luffy goes Gear 4th, and then him, Law, and Kid end up destroying a Beast Pirate ship. And then immediately after he uses Gear 4th, Luffy is back to his normal base form, which means that Gear 4th no longer drains Luffy's haki anymore like it did back in Dressrosa.
And I know this is controversial, but I attribute that to Luffy mastering Rio. Because in chapter 940, Hyogoro tells Luffy that in order to master Rio, you have to be able to channel haki from the parts of your body that aren't using it into your attacks. In other words, your body is a source of haki, but you're not using all of it at the same time. So you have to be able to sort of extract the haki from places that you're not really using it and then channel that into your attacks. If you remember, there was a flashback, I think it was either in Dressrosa or Whole Cake Island, where Rayleigh tells Luffy, the problem with your Gear 4th is that it taxes your body way too much. It takes way too much haki from you. So you have to come up with another way of being able to do what you're doing. And so because with Rio, you have to learn how to channel haki through your body, I think that also helps the user with the distribution of haki throughout their body so that they can use it more efficiently. So that's why Luffy doesn't get messed up every time he uses Gear 4th anymore.
I don't think anybody suspected that the Tobiropo that Queen wanted to take out in this situation was Drake, so I have to give props to Oda for handling that misdirection very, very smartly. Because the first time we see Who's Who, right, Who's Who says something like, hypothetically speaking, if Queen were to die tonight, who do you guys think would take his place? So at first he kind of made it seem as if the one that Who's Who wanted to take out was Queen, when in reality, like, he's been trying to bait Drake from the start. And then later in chapter 980, Queen says that he wants to get rid of one of the Tobiropo, so I automatically assumed that he was talking about Who's Who, when in reality, it was Drake all this time. So I think Oda did a really good job at playing with our expectations here, and not letting us suspect that Kaido's men were already on to Drake.
And speaking of playing with expectations, it would not surprise me if that 1% chance of survival ends up being a complete red herring. What I mean is this, right? So Oda says, somebody has 99% chance of dying, right? And the fandom is so focused on trying to figure out who this 1% character is, right? Like with theories and stuff. And then we finally get to that moment, and in that near-death experience, we find out that somebody else completely unrelated to that 1% is the one who ends up dying. It's kind of like a really cruel magic trick where you're like, oh, look over here. And then all of a sudden, oh no, the real surprise was over there all along.
I thought the ending of this chapter was really good. Drake goes into his hybrid form, so again, it's his strongest form, and he uses an attack called Excalibur to essentially one-shot the number in front of him. And Luffy does the same thing with Kongun. Now, what made me like the scene even more is that there's kind of an Easter egg here. So like I said last week, the number that Luffy takes out in this final page is number 5, right? Because he was laughing Goki Goki, and so of course Go means 5 in Japanese. And Luffy has also been known to be associated with the number 5 because of his devil fruit power, the Gomu Gomu no Mi. That's why sometimes you'll see that Oda draws Luffy wearing shirts that have the number 56 on them, because Go is 5, and then the 6 you can also pronounce it as Mu. So it reads Gomu, right? And then Drake's name is DS Drake. DS means 10 in Spanish, and he also has the X in his name, X Drake. The X, of course, being the Roman numeral for 10. And so it turns out that I was right last week that the number that Drake takes out in this final page is the 10 because he calls him Juki, and Ju is 10 in Japanese. So Luffy takes out the 5, Drake takes out the 10. They both end up defeating a number that has something to do with them as characters. Also, I do think that Drake being bloodied up like that and then being able to pull off an explosion to escape Queen, Who's Who, and Hawkins should be considered as a feat, because essentially I think he turns into his hybrid form. Yeah, he goes into his hybrid form to be able to tank the explosion and escape. So I definitely think that that should be considered as a feat for Drake. Not just tanking an explosion, but also being able to escape a second Yonko commander, Who's Who, and Hawkins. I've already talked about how there's some evidence in the text to suggest that Ulti is an awakened prehistoric Zoan, so I would not be surprised, because he was also part of the Tobiropo for Drake to also be an awakened Zoan, just like Ulti.
Thus far, it seems that Luffy, Drake, and Frankie have been able to one-shot one of these numbers, right? Because Frankie took one out last week. So to me, that means that everybody who is above Frankie in the crew should also be able to one-shot a number as well. So I'm thinking about like Zoro, Jinbei, Sanji. They should be able to one-shot a number as well. Now, surprisingly, there was a lot of confusion, like people suggesting that what Drake was yelling at the end of this chapter was that he was actually kind of asking Luffy to join his crew. And I don't know why that confusion came about. Like, to me, it's pretty obvious that he's only asking to be an ally during this fight against Kaido. But then also, like, you do know that Drake isn't a pirate, right? Like, he's just pretending to be a pirate. So Drake asking Luffy for a spot in the Straw Hats doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then in the official translation, I'm just gonna read you like a little bit of the internal monologue that Drake has with himself as he's escaping, right? So he pulls off the explosion, and this is what Drake says. He says, "What should I do? Where do I run? Is there any way back to the Navy? No, that comes later." So that pretty much confirms that Drake is thinking of reincorporating himself into the Marines at some point. He's thinking of going back. I don't think that Luffy and Drake have actually ever met formally, so I really appreciate Luffy's reaction by the end there. Drake is like, "Please let me fight on your side," and Luffy's just like, "Huh? Like, who are you?" I also liked how before Drake makes his decision, he thinks of Kobe. Kobe is the motivating factor into informing Drake that he can count on Luffy. Now, because Drake is still technically in the Marines, he's a member of SWORD, this is huge because it kind of formalizes a pirate-marine alliance, if you think about it. It kind of means that Drake can put in a good word for Luffy with other Marines so that by the end of the series, Luffy has, a fraction, right, of the Marines on his side. So the members of SWORD could be allies to Luffy during the final war. And that's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I thought this was a good, solid chapter of One Piece. Who do you think has a 99% chance of meeting their end in this arc? Let me know down in the comment section. I can already see the joke comments, like it's somebody like Panda Man or Gin. Gin has 1% chance, or Gaimon. Before you go, I would really appreciate if you didn't do what King's birds did in this chapter and disappear. Please don't fly away just yet. If you can, leave me a like. You can also follow me on Instagram at Team7Mage. You don't have to, but just know it's available. Okay, now you can fly away. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Catch you guys later. Bye.